The Cipher Brief, because national security is everyone's business.
So I'm going to turn the stage over to former CIA Director General David Petraeus and Silverado Policy Accelerator Dmitry Alperovich to compare their notes on this one. Gentlemen, welcome.
Thanks for the invitation to be part of this event together with so many impressive experts. And thanks for allowing me, Suzanne, to ask some questions of Dmitry Alperovich, who of course emigrated to the US with his parents from Russia when he was 15. So he still is a Russian speaker, earned bachelor's and master's degrees in computer science from Georgia Tech, became vice president for threat research of McAfee, where he identified Chinese cyber intrusions into over 70 major organizations, then was co-founder and CTO of CrowdStrike and is now co-founder and chairman of the Silverado Policy Accelerator. And in return for answering my questions, he gets to ask me questions. So let me begin, Dmitry. Few cyber experts understand the Russian state and non-state cyber capabilities better than you do. And of course, we discussed when we were together at the Munich Security Conference and then while flying back home that a Russian cyber offensive would likely be one of the components of a Russian invasion. We waited for it and waited for it. Something did happen, but not huge. So it didn't really materialize, nor have the substantial Russian cyber attacks about which a US president actually warned America first, I believe. So what happened?
Well, first of all, an honor to always be on stage with you, General. Thank you so much, Suzanne, for organizing this terrific event. I think you have to separate the two pieces. First of all, the cyber offensive in Ukraine, and then the attacks that didn't yet materialize against the West. So when it came to Ukraine, we actually did see a number of cyber attacks, and probably the most impactful cyber attacks ever orchestrated in wartime took place in the first hours of the invasion on February 24th, when the Russian intelligence services, Russian military intelligence in particular, broke into an American company called Viasat that last year purchased a company called KSAT that provides satellite communications equipment in Eastern Europe and is used heavily by the Ukrainian military. And what they're able to do is look at the modems that are within the spot beam of Ukraine from that satellite and push out a malicious update that essentially brick those satellite communications modems. And we have statements from the Ukrainians later on, like Viktor Zhorov, who runs cybersecurity for the Ukrainian government, sort of their version of CISA, saying that this had a huge effect on the ability of the Ukrainians to communicate with each other, coordinate their forces in the first crucial 48 hours of the invasion. The reason that it didn't get that much attention, of course, is because it was overshadowed by the kinetic operations that took place with the rolling of armor into Ukraine, the shelling of Ukrainian cities, that understandably so attracted all of the TV cameras and media coverage. But I think the lesson that we can take from Ukraine and both that cyber attack and other ongoing cyber attacks that the Russians kept using since then is that resiliency matters. And the reality is that the Ukrainians have had 8 years of experience of getting hammered just constantly by Russians. Of course, many people listening to this show remember the NotPetya attacks, the most destructive attacks, global destructive attacks in history, and various other attacks that the Russians used initially against Ukraine. And as a result, the Ukrainians have gotten really, really good at rebuilding networks quickly, mitigating damage. Even when the Russians were able to shut off power to Ukraine twice in 2015 and 2016, the Ukrainians got into their trucks, drove to the substations, flipped the circuit breakers, and got things back up and operational. And the Russians, by the way, tried to, again, shut down power through cyber attacks and apparently had some success in limited area during the course of this invasion. But of course, the overarching lesson here is that if you've got kinetic options, if you can create a crater somewhere, take out a substation, take out a communication system, that's what you're going to prefer to use. That's what's easier to use. That's what's easiest to get lasting damage with than with cyber. And then when it comes to attacks against the West, I think we're still waiting to see what Putin is going to do. He's been very, very cautious about the confrontation with the West. I think he's been very surprised by the sanctions that have been put in place on Russia. and he's still hoping to get a negotiated outcome. And in fact, just a few hours ago, the Russian deputy foreign minister said that the Russians are willing to unblock the blockade of the Black Sea that is strangling the Ukrainian economy in exchange for relief from sanctions. So I think that's why he has not decided to yet escalate things in cyberspace vis-a-vis us, because he hopes that he can get some sort of diplomatic resolution to the issue.
Got it. And of course, our friends at Rob Joyce's place of employment reportedly did help out our Ukrainian partners considerably, and reportedly that continues, albeit without boots on the ground inside Ukraine, which of course is not required in cyberspace anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. But General, let me ask you a question now. You were, of course, famously the commander of the 101st Airborne during the invasion of Iraq. So you're actually one of the few people that knows what it's like to invade a country. And you famously asked one of your embedded reporters, Rick Atkinson, tell me what happens next. So let me pose the same question to you. You've been a keen observer of this war since day one. Where do you think things stand on the ground right now?
Well, first of all, I should just note it was tell me how this ends. And it was because all of the assumptions that we've been provided outside Kuwait City when we were preparing to do the invasion were being disproven one by one. As to some degree, many of the projections, of course, about how long the Ukrainians could hold out, how quickly the Russians could sack Kyiv and replace President Zelensky with a pro-Russian figure and all the rest of this, have also been disproven. And of course, we should note, just quickly that in the first 3 months, the Ukrainians won the Battle of Kyiv. The Russians couldn't even get really into the suburbs of Kyiv all that well. They eventually withdrew their forces. The Ukrainians won the battles of Sumy and Chernihiv, two other northern cities, and now they appear to have won the Battle of Kharkiv, the second largest city, and of course in far eastern Ukraine near the Russian border, where the Ukrainians have pushed the Russians back out of artillery range. But in the meantime, of course, the Russians have finally started to concentrate their forces rather than attacking everywhere and thus attacking really nowhere. They've really established a main effort. They have one commander in charge now instead of the three that were in charge in the beginning months of the war. He, to be sure, is the butcher of Syria, earned that nickname in 2016 when General Dvornikov oversaw the bombing of Aleppo, basically the depopulation of the parts of Aleppo that were most problematic for Bashar al-Assad's regime forces. We have seen now, though, in the past week or so, the momentum shift back to the Russians as they really have concentrated their forces around the city of Severodonetsk and trying to take Severodonetsk, and instead of the big encirclements that they were seeking earlier to take out all of Luhansk and the Ukrainian forces, to just take bite-sized pieces and then perhaps expand on them. And so, how this ends, I'm not sure, first of all, that it does end for some point in time. Obviously, on the one hand, you have President Zelensky, who has seen terrible loss of life to civilians, military forces, and so forth. He said the other day it's as much as 100 per day, which would be an enormous figure, again, including all, and maybe that's casualties, not just killed, but in some days that has been killed. And of course, you do see them receiving the enormous number of weapon systems, other arms, ammunition, supplies, and so forth, just flowing in to Ukraine, and the Ukrainians very impressively getting those into the front lines and using them very expertly as well. In the meantime, Russia, again, under pressure, enormous pressure, sanctions on its economy, its financial system, its business community. Nearly 1,000 companies in Russia have either halted what they do, pulled out entirely, or reduced what it is they're doing. The latest now, McDonald's, Starbucks, and some others. So that pressure, and the pressure individually on Putin's inner circle as well, plus Putin watches as probably 350,000 talented Russians have left the country rather than stay in a homeland that is the pariah of the international world. So that's on that one hand, and the Russian loss is very, very substantial. The documented losses are, way up in the, I'm sure you look at Oryx as well, and the actually verified losses of Russian weapon systems, vehicles, and others are up approaching 4,000. They are
In general,
personal.
I was just in Germany, and one senior government official commented to me how the Russians have verifiably lost 600 tanks, which he said is more than Germany has in total number of tanks in their military. It's incredible.
I think it's twice as much as what the British have in their military at this point in time. So it's a staggering amount, again, of tanks and other armored systems. By the way, many of those have been captured by the Ukrainians. So the Ukrainians, on paper at least, actually have more tanks than they had when they actually started this particular war. And they're receiving more, of course, from various Eastern European countries that can provide the tanks, the multiple launch rocket systems, the air defense systems, and even in some cases some fighters that are compatible with what the Ukrainians have. Of course, that being one of the restrictions. We can't give them the M1 Abrams battle tank. They just can't maintain it. You know, it's a completely different system. All the diagnostics, test kits and outfits, as they're called, just aren't there. The training just of the mechanics alone would take quite a considerable period of time. In any event, these are the dynamics there. As I said, the Russians seem to have the momentum. My sense, Dmitry, is that they're going to seize as much as they can. They'll try to get all of Luhansk province, Oblast, try to get more of Donetsk. But at some point, they're going to begin to harden the front lines of what it is they have seized. And then they likely will declare that it is annexed into the Russian Federation. There will be some new titles for these new acquisitions, and then maybe more rattling of the nuclear saber and say, if you attack us now, you could, risk escalation, et cetera, et cetera. The question, though, is can the Russians sustain this? Again, given the extraordinary loss of materiel and personnel, and can the Ukrainians continue to provide forces? They have to have replacements as well. Of course, it's a country that is fully mobilized, and every able-bodied male and many others are all helping the war effort in some capacity. These are the dynamics, and how it ends could literally run the gamut from a Russian collapse, which is not out of the thinkable. It is certainly, I think, in the realm of the possible. You could see some kind of crumbling of the Ukrainian forces, although I think that they're going to have the grit. They may give up Severodonetsk and some of the other cities. There's reports that they are actually planning to do that now rather than create another Mariupol surrounded location, or the bastion of the 21st century. You could actually see again a new frozen conflict with new front lines, just as we had, of course, after the 2014 acquisitions of Crimea and that portion of the Donbass that was controlled by the Russian-supported separatists. So I think quite a range of possibilities. But right now, I don't see either president as willing to do anything more than to continue to see what his forces can achieve on the battlefield, respectively. And of course, with additional support being provided now, a $40 billion package of the United States alone, bipartisan package on Capitol Hill, of course, signed by the president. And you see what all the other countries are doing. The contact group just met the other day, virtually hosted by the U.S. Secretary of Defense, and the Danes agreed to give Harpoon cruise missiles, anti-ship missiles, to the Ukrainians. So the capabilities are increasing, especially on the Ukrainian side. And we're going to see how these dynamics play out in what I think are very pivotal days and weeks that lie ahead. So
this was really fascinating, but let me ask you this.
Sure.
We've spoken many times in the last 3 months of the disastrous planning and training of the Russian forces, how they've pretty much done everything poorly except maybe withdrawal from Kiev. But the question I have is, in this battle of Donbass, where they are making gains, where they're taking territory, despite making lots of mistakes like that poor bridge crossing where they got decimated, the entire brigade got decimated, and apparently they failed that on several occasions. But nevertheless, you're looking at them making gains, and the correlation of forces, people believe, is more or less equal, where the number of troops that the Russians have and the Ukrainians are pretty much the same. The Russians, of course, have an advantage in fires. Do you attribute that to better organizational, one commander under Dvornikov, one single thrust of forces? Is that why they're making gains in the way that they haven't previously?
That is part of it. They are concentrating their forces. They're really focusing. Also, they are getting better at targeting critical infrastructure and also Ukrainian headquarters, staging areas for the arms and ammunition that are coming in, fuel depots, and again, a variety of even civilian infrastructure that nonetheless is supportive of the military activities that Ukraine is carrying out. Beyond that, they're willing just to bomb massively and indiscriminately. It's really not just bomb, but it's still a very artillery-centric force. The Russians, the Soviets always have been, and using missiles and rockets and so forth as well. So they're just obliterating these eastern Ukrainian cities. And, you know, it's a case of doing to them what they did to Grozny or what they did to a substantial part of Aleppo in Syria. And at a certain point in time, I think the Ukrainians will recognize that, well, okay, we probably ought to just withdraw from this, remarshal, figure out where we can capitalize on some Russian weakness. The key is going to be finding that Russian flank that they could really push and roll up. The problem being that I suspect that they also lack the expeditionary force logistics that, remember, you and I discussed that once the Russians leave the rail system that is so important to their logistics, they have 1/4 the logistics infrastructure in their organizational structure that we have in ours. So we could actually attack, you know, hundreds and hundreds of miles to Baghdad with what we could bring with us, and then go back and replenish over time. They just don't have that capacity, and I suspect that the same is true on the Ukrainian side. They're fighting largely from fixed logistics bases, but as the Russians target those bases, this gets more challenging for them. And of course, in this case, keep in mind the Russians are very close to what really was fixed logistics based in that part of the Donbass controlled by the separatists, and of course close to the border with Russia as well. And we'll see if they get farther, then their lines get extended, whether the Ukrainians can capitalize on that. But what I'm sketching out, I think probably what comes out of this is somewhat of a dynamic, very bloody stalemate war of attrition, rather than what the hope for Ukrainian breakthrough. Although that is not at all. Again, there are intangibles here, and how the Russian soldiers fight is very much an important one of those.
Indeed.
But let me in turn, you have publicly advocated for a number of years, as did I, for CISA, and we're finally seeing real improvements to our national cybersecurity posture. Cyber Command finally elevated to full-fledged combatant command status. Cyberspace is a domain of warfare in our doctrinal manuals equal to land, sea, air, and outer space. The establishment of the Cybersecurity and Information Security Agency, the Cyberspace Solarium Commission, the National Cyber Director position, and picking three real stars to serve as the director of CISA, National Cyber Director, and Deputy National Security Advisor for Cyber and Emerging Technology, Jen Easterly, Chris Inglis, and Newberger. Given all of that, all these improvements, how do you now assess the state of US cybersecurity?
It's a great question. There's no doubt that we've made terrific progress, and we just crossed the 1-year anniversary of the executive order that Ann Newberger put together for the president that moved the ball forward considerably on the security of the federal government, optimizing federal procurement to make sure that we're asking more of companies that are supplying critical technologies to the federal government and that they're doing the right things when it comes to security. It established within CISA the Cyber Safety Review Board, which I'm proud member of, and Rob Joyce and Chair Rob Silvers and many other terrific people that are involved, Chris Inglis, of course. And the job of that board is to systematically review major cyber incidents of critical importance, and sort of like the NTSB does in a similar fashion, figure out what are the key lessons learned from each and every incident and what recommendations can we provide to both the federal government and industry to improve things going forward. It's amazing that cybersecurity as an industry has existed for well over 35 plus years, but we have not really been doing a good job of taking our learnings like the US military does. Of course, we don't have a training command where we look back at our past engagements and figure out how we do things better. And the Cyber Safety Review Board, CSRB, was a critical component to try to move that forward. So I think we're on the right path. We're still in the very early innings of this, of course. While we've had some legislation in Congress that's been very helpful, Silverado's been a big proponent of the cyber breach reporting legislation that was just passed a couple of months ago to require companies to report information to the government about when they've been breached, when they pay ransom, so that the US government would have information system, in particular in the FBI, about what's actually taking place within our networks in this nation. But the next step, I think, that's required, I believe, is going to be some regulation, regulation that is not prescriptive for industry, because I don't think prescriptive regulation can work in this fast-paced moving environment, but where we hold industry accountable for the results, particularly industry that is responsible for critical infrastructure. If things like Colonial Pipeline take place, or power goes out in a city somewhere, you need to look hard at whether the companies did all the things that they had to do to make sure that something that is a critical resource for the nation from a national security perspective is really well protected. And I think we're still a ways away from having the authorities granted by Congress to do something like that, although it's starting to move in the right direction. So I think we're making progress, but it's still there's still a lot to be done. And of course, cybersecurity, you're never done. So it's always going to be something to improve upon and something we can learn from others, frankly. You look at what the Ukrainians have done. While they're not that great at defending against intrusions, in many cases, they're very, very good on resiliency and making sure that if things are taken down, you can bring them back up quickly. There's a lot that we can learn there that we just have not done, particularly in our critical infrastructure. But let me ask you this, you in turn have also advocated for elevation of US Cyber Command to be a full-fledged combatant command that it is now, and the creation of CISA. You've served on the board of Optiv, the largest pure-play cybersecurity services firm. Of course, the firm that you're with right now as a partner is a large investor, I think the largest investor in Colonial Pipeline, that suffered that very devastating ransomware attack just about a year ago. How do you see the cyber landscape these days, and what do you think needs to be done?
Well, a bit like you, I think I've seen, there's really very significant improvements. And I should just note, it's publicly known that in the case of Colonial Pipeline, the DOJ has an extraordinary element now that actually tracked down the cryptocurrency that we provided, the Bitcoin, and actually got it back. Unfortunately, the value of it was one of those periods where it went down, so we still lost a bit of money. The key was, frankly, to get the pipeline going again, because the lack of refined fuel products on the East Coast just was already starting to create problems in volatility. But what we see are enormous improvements, these ones that you and I have mentioned organizationally. The individuals that are in these positions, and of course the commander of Cybercom has been extended for a year, Paul Nakasone, which is great. We have generally the right big ideas. They'll still need refinement, and certainly there needs to be a Center for Army Lessons Learned really built out. Again, that's starting, the equivalent of that. The key now, I think, is just ensuring that there are the additional authorities. The one I'd focus on, I think, is really mandatory sharing much more rapidly than the very lenient sharing rules. But of course, the problem with that is then you've got to have some kind of insurance scheme if there's an effect financially on a firm because it does what the government says it has to do, and then there's a big loss to shareholders as a result of that. So you've got to work your way through that kind of issue. It's really about building it out now. If you have the right big ideas, you have a sense of CISA as the quarterback, they've got all the feeds and ties and everything with all of the expertise in NSA, CIA, FBI, and elsewhere. It's about the additional appropriations and authorizations. And then it's about these other entities that are the ones actually overseeing critical infrastructure. Of course, again, CISA doesn't do that directly, it does for elections, but that's a one-off. Normally it does it through a department or agency. In the case of the financial community, of course, it's through Treasury. That's the gold standard. They've really built it out. They just can't afford more breaches and the penalties that comes with that and reputational loss. But then you have, of course, TSA that oversees, as we found out, pipeline structures in America, not a core cybersecurity, not a core area of expertise for them. How do you help them? How do they benefit from the lessons learned by other departments and that can be generally applied? And then how do they specifically get into that particular area? And how do they oversee, again, to make sure this was a very simple breach? It was a password kind of violation, if you will, and getting that built out again. And then at some point, mastering how there can be the real-time machine speed sharing of threat information, and of course, even more important, the measures that need to be taken for mitigating that risk. These are very, very challenging issues. Clearly, the big ideas are not completely formed, nor are the organizational architectural items and how this would all be done, the procedures, the SOPs, and so forth. But that's, I think, what has to be done to build on what has commendably been done over the course of probably just the last 3 or 4 years, though, that we've seen all of this level of progress after a number of us, frankly, out in the wilderness calling for some of what happily has come to pass. But let me turn this back to you, and what may have to be the final question, we'll see. I want to ask a specific one about a cutting edge development in cyber world, and you've been on that cutting, maybe even bleeding edge. And I'm sure the audience would love to hear your thoughts about whether true quantum computing might actually arrive, and if it does, what the implications are for cybersecurity.
It's a tough question. Well, we're making progress in terms of fundamental research on quantum computing, getting into scale calculations to greater numbers, although still very, very small in the true quantum calculation sense. But more likely than not, we're going to be able to figure it out. I think it's going to take a lot longer than people think. A lot of these technologies, we tend to underestimate the time that it takes to develop them. The reality is, when it comes to something that fundamental from a physics perspective, it's just much harder to do than most people anticipate. But the real danger here for cybersecurity is that many of the encryption algorithms we rely on, of course, will be broken by quantum computing. So even if it arrives 20, 30 years from now, you have a lot of very sensitive communications, classified communications in government that are being transmitted today. We know our adversaries are recording those encrypted communications, and if they get a quantum computer in a couple of decades, they'd be able to go back and read through that. I'll point out, many of your audience may remember the Venona project, famous project by the NSA to look at 2 years worth of communications that were picked up during World War II from the Soviets. And so in the late 1943, 1944, they were able to record that. And then for the next 40 years, NSA worked diligently to break that communication because the Russians ended up reusing cryptographic materials, which introduced fundamental weaknesses in the algorithm. So for 40 years, that information still presented a lot of value in understanding what the Soviets were doing, their agents, and so forth. So that's the real danger, and that's why the NSA is working on new standards for algorithms that are quantum resistance. Those algorithms do exist, so it's not that we have to reinvent the wheel from scratch, but there needs to be work that will be done to make sure that they're safe and secure and can last for many, many decades. And then there'll be a process for government and industry to adopt those new protocols, new algorithms, and do so hopefully long before quantum computing arrives. So that's the real danger that I see. But luckily, for once, we're on top of things and we're working diligently to avoid a disaster.
Gentlemen, let me jump in here. I think we could listen to you both all day. This has been great information. We do have a question. This one coming from Paulo Delcin, who's one of our SIG principals here. And you started off your conversation talking about the Viasat compromise and the modems. when we talk about, his question is the attention level need to be raised for satellite and space infrastructure to really build in that resilience so that things like this aren't as impactful as they seem?
Well, I think there's no question about it. So if you look at what happened here, the fact that the Russians weren't just able to get into the network, but able to send an update to tens of thousands of modems located in Ukraine and brick them. And by the way, it didn't just affect Ukraine, because there were a number of modems that were used in Germany that were supporting windmills that are still down to this day, and can be connected to. So there was quite a bit of collateral damage here as well. And the fact that this was allowed to happen, that there was no manual override controls to do something on that scale by a remote actor or even an insider within the firm, I think is a real issue. So we do have to look at both commercial and government implications of satellite communications that we rely on for so much these days. Communication, intelligence collection, weather forecasting, pretty much everything. When you start thinking about it, the economic impact, there's no doubt that the vulnerabilities are numerous.
And General Petraeus, I would turn to you, and in addition to your follow-up on that question, just talking about sort of the escalation aspect of this, as we talk about other countries getting impacts, and where you see some of this playing.
Well, what I was going to stress, in fact, that there are other countries that are literally establishing their own architecture so that they could take down what it is that we and our allies depend on and use what they have put in the sky. And so I think, again, this is an area of real vulnerability. You know, when I think of the enormous reliance that we had on, you know, we used to fight over these 25 megahertz channels and chips and so forth. I mean, that was one of the areas that I could never get enough of as a commander on the battlefield. It was right up there with unmanned aerial vehicles that you were allocating shortages, not allocating all the assets that you needed. So that underscores the critical dependence we have on those. And it also therefore underscores the critical vulnerability were another country to take out our access to those and rely on its own system. And so again, this is one of the reasons, of course, that Space Command has been brought out and made its own service. And I'm sure that I know that there's enormous focus on this kind of issue and on the vulnerabilities that we have in that area.
All right, well, gentlemen, I'm going to have to wrap it up for now. Thank you so much for letting us all listen in on this great conversation.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks, Suzanne. And thanks above all, Dimitri.
Thank you so much, General. Thank you, everyone.